introduce my dear friend, Manal. Thank you, John, for the fine introduction. So it is my honor to introduce my dear friend, Manal Omar. She is indeed a constant source of strength and inspiration for all of us. I admire and appreciate her leadership. As you all know, that I serve, as John said, as a member of the International Advisory Council at the United States Institute of Peace. I've been also a significant donor to U.S. Institute of Peace. And this is where I was introduced to Manal. As you all know, the U.S. Institute of Peace mission is a nonviolent prevention of conflict and conflict mitigations. And those are the values that I embrace too, and those are the values that the Manal also embrace. She joins us this evening from the United States Institute of Peace, where she serves as the acting vice president for the Center for the Middle East and Africa. Prior to this assignment, Manal responded to humanitarian crisis in Palestine and Lebanon as the regional program manager for the Middle East for Oxfam, Great Britain. She worked with the Women for Women International as the regional coordinator for Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan, and served as the international advisor for the Libya stabilization team in Benghazi. I'm sure Hillary can use that. She's testifying on Thursday at the House. Manal's experience in the Middle East is extensive and includes 3 years working for the World Bank's Development Economic Group, several years as a journalist, covering lead assignment for UNESCO in Iraq, and countless days carrying out training programs in Yemen, Bahrain, Afghanistan, Sudan, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Kenya, and many other countries. It is no wonder that Manal was named one of the top 500 world's most influential Arabs. She is an Arab American. She was born in North Carolina, if I remember correctly. She grew up in Virginia. Is it somebody from North Carolina? And she was listed among the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. Manal's activity have been profiled in the Washington Times, the Los Angeles Times, the BBC, NPR, and Glamour, the London Times, and the Newsweek. Her articles and opinion pieces have appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Aziza Magazine, and Islamic Magazine. In addition, Manal has authored encyclopedia entries, briefing papers, book chapters, short story, a U.S. Institute of Peace blog, and her own personal memoir entitled Barefoot in Baghdad, A Story of Identity, My Own, What It Means to Be a Woman in Chaos. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Manal, a great friend of mine, Manal Omar.
Thank you, Frank, for that wonderfully warm introduction and for all the guidance, the generosity, and the advice that you've offered me personally and the U.S. Institute of Peace. We're filled with gratitude for people who really take interest, again, not only in terms of the mission, but the day-to-day activities. I also want to thank Montgomery College and Joan for organizing this event. It's been seamless, so well organized, and all of you for being here with me tonight. I greatly appreciate it. And I look forward, I love that you use the word conversation, because I really look forward to having a conversation. And what I'll do is try and keep my talking to a minimal so I can actually hear from you questions and answers and have a dialogue in terms of what may interest you the most. But first, I'll start off by talking about what took a girl from South Carolina into the international world. And so partially, I was, come from a family of refugees. My family went through 5 countries. We're originally from Palestine and went through 5 countries before they were able to settle down in, they chose Lubbock, Texas, and then when I came along, we were in South Carolina. And from a very young age, I was that nerdy child when people said, what do you want to be? Very early on, I want to be with the United Nations. And that was just very clear to me. I wanted to do something international. I felt my parents had benefited from the American immigrant experience, and I wanted to find a way to give back to the world. So fresh out of college, I worked part-time as a journalist, went overseas, and then was recruited by the UN. Long, interesting story in itself. But I went and was stationed in Iraq and Baghdad in 1997. So that was my first position, and I was at the time with UNESCO. Within a year, my dream kind of ended, because it was a time of the oil for food, it was a time of sanctions, and I witnessed firsthand what sanctions was doing to a country. And I felt really torn, so I resigned and couldn't stay with the UN longer, particularly because of sanctions. But it really opened up my eyes to a whole other world that I didn't understand, which was the economic world. And so I decided to come back to the US and complete my master's. I did Arab studies with a concentration in economics and development. And that became, for the next 5 years, a big part of my focus, was looking at development work, looking at economics, trying to understand this world, which in many ways was a new way of outreach, and some more cynical people would say the new form of colonialism was how do you work through economics. And so I wanted to understand it, did my master's, and spent 3 years at the World Bank. As I started doing development, my heart started getting pulled back into more of the humanitarian world, which is when I shifted back into the not-for-profit sector. And so through Women for Women International and Oxfam, I started working in humanitarian, and again, a little bit more of the development, but more grassroots. What I realized very quickly as I was working on the humanitarian side, and most of my work was in the region, was that it was Band-Aid solutions. No matter what we were doing, it would never be enough. The Syrian crisis really drives home this point today. No matter how much we respond, the need is always going to be far greater than any response. And that was another shift for me. So about 5 years into doing humanitarian and development, I realized the importance of understanding conflict. Because at the end of the day, whether it's economic, whether it's humanitarian, whether it's development, all it takes is for one conflict, and it doesn't have to be just national conflict. It can be local conflicts in communities that really erase any progress that took place. And so for a very long time, I realized for me to actually be able to influence the change that I wanted to as a child, I might have to come back to DC. And I thought a lot about it in terms of which city. So when I was working for Oxfam, I was based in London. I spent a lot of times in Paris and Brussels. I considered New York, particularly because of the United Nations. But for the part of the world that I focus on, which is Middle East and Africa, it really is Washington, D.C., where decisions are being made that have tremendous effect across the regions. And so that's one of the reasons why I decided to come back to D.C., and one of the reasons why I decided to join the U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace is an organization, it's a federal institute that focuses on conflict prevention. And one of the things that I like about the Institute is we look at conflict as something that's positive. A lot of times when you look at conflict, it can lead to accountability, it can lead to growth, it can lead to difficult conversations that then lead to stronger understanding and diversity. So the trick is, how do you handle conflict without having to resort to violence? And that's truly a trick, because as an international community, our first response can be violence. So it's very hard to go into countries and say, respond through nonviolence when our first instinct is also to respond through violence. So the idea of nonviolence is often a very difficult message to send for people who want to take action now. And that's both international as well as the countries I work in. But what I thought I'd do tonight is to talk about the top 10 lessons that I've learned working in the field for about 20 years. What are my main takeaways that I wanted to share, and which I always try to share, particularly, as I mentioned, coming back into DC, my goal is to influence policymakers as much as it is to do programming internationally. So the first thing, and this is particularly when we're talking about civil society, but more specifically when we're looking at women, but overall, oftentimes, we're so entrenched in a security lens that we can forget other partners on the ground, and particularly thinking of civil society. Many times when I talk to people, and particularly those who are involved in the security sector, and say, where is the civil society? I always get the response, well, we can't deal with that now. Once we secure the country, once we do stabilization, we can start talking about civil society and youth and women and minorities and all these other people, but we gotta secure the country first. And my response is always the same. You're not going to secure the country until you talk about these people, starting with women, but looking at youth and looking at minorities. The reality is it's not a nice thing to do. It's not a soft, human rights only thing when we're talking about civil society. It's absolutely necessary if we want to stabilize and we want to help countries in transition. Because civil society is often the early detection warning sign for people in conflict. So, often I tell people when we look at the emergence of the Islamic State, a lot of people in Washington will talk about it as a new phenomenon. Some people will date it back to 2010, when in reality the Islamic State was registered in some form in the terrorist list since 2006. As early as 2009, Iraqi women were warning there's an extremist element that is alien and ahistorical to us that we don't know how to navigate around. And it was dismissed as a women's issue, as a civil society issue. It wasn't taken on board. And it was a missed opportunity to use civil society, in this case to use women, as an early detection sign to actually catch something when it was still in a preventable mode. And so, again, I'm always saying it's not nice when we're talking about civil society. It's necessary. And for this reason, I'm absolutely thrilled. I think a lot of you heard about the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the Tunisian Quartet. And this was a group of 4 civil society, diverse groups. Some were human rights lawyers, some were labor unions, who came together when the country was really in threat of polarizing between their political parties and civil society, stepped forward and said, no, this is not what we took to the streets, this is not what we want to see. And they played a very active role in bringing the political parties back to the table and continuing the national dialogue process. So it was good to see that on an international level, civil society was prompted up, and I'd like to see more investment in civil society, again, not just as a nice, soft thing to do, but something that's strategic and within our national interests. The second point that I always like to emphasize is that there's never one single driver of conflict. And this is a hard one, especially in Washington when you're talking about policymakers. People like simplicity. So, if there's one driver of conflict, that means there's one solution. We get to invest in the solution and hopefully we're done. But what we've seen is that there's always too many nuances in the context, even in terms of what you see in terms of emerging international threats or patterns. The context that they're in is so specific that you really have to be able to understand the nuances and the context to be able to talk about the solutions. And again, this is a problem, and I always see it in a lot of the circles that I'm sitting in. People just glaze over. They don't want the nuances. They want quick action. Policymakers are built to think short term. So one of the challenges I often face is, how do I make it simpler? How do I make sure I don't lose the nuances? I bring in the granularity of the analysis, but I make it in a way that policymakers can actually turn it into recommendations and steps. And it's still today one of my biggest challenges, because I want to get in and describe all the issues and all the details, but oftentimes it's not the most strategic way to communicate. So just like there's no one driver of conflict, it's also important to think about how to actually bridge that divide between practitioners in the field and policymakers who are over here in capitals not necessarily knowing the connection. The third area that I like to talk about is, just like I was saying, civil society is important, and when you look at youth, you look at women, you look at minorities, you look at different groups, one of the biggest challenges is when they stay in civil society. So the fact that they're active is really important, and it's always a great way to hold their governments accountable. But at one point or time, it's also important to be able to transition, not necessarily into official public service or into government, but particularly in times of transitions, to find their way to the negotiating table, to find a way to make sure that their voices are heard. Because what often happens is civil society groups, and particularly, a lot of my specialty is focused on women, particularly women's groups, tend to be comfortable in the informal. And because they're comfortable in the informal, they often miss the opportunity to influence decision. And it's true of a lot of the international community here. A lot of times there's very strict rules in the past about civilian and military interactions and exactly how we interact with government, particularly formal government. And if we're not interacting, a lot of times what happens is a missed opportunity to actually influence recommendations. And we know 90% of the time they're not going to listen to civil society. But still, that 10% can be very powerful, and it's important to continue to be there and to find ways to transition into more of a formal decision-making and not just on what people call the streets or the protests, but to actually have a way to be within the negotiating table and the decision-making. The fourth area, and this is often a challenge just because of logistical and programmatic reality, is how can we as an international community, when we're doing work in peace building, how do we move beyond the usual suspects? A lot of times when you're looking at the UN, the World Bank, local NGOs, international NGOs, US government, there tends to be the same group of people that emerge internationally. And those group of people tend to look a lot like us, sound a lot like us, and speak English and have computer literacy. And so we tend to have a very narrow view into a country because of the type of partners that we select. And so one of the challenges that we need to have is how do we actually push past the usual suspects? How do we go out into the rural areas? How do we talk to people who may still be computer illiterate? Often we talk about penetration in terms of the internet in countries where electricity is still a problem. So, the idea of social media being a form of outreach and moving out, all of it has its limitations. And particularly when we're looking at areas of conflict zones, because they've been so destabilized by conflict, they often don't have the access that other countries have. So it's a real challenge. And then add on top all of the security concerns. I mean, there's a lot of legitimate reasons to why we stick to the same people. But that same group has really limited our understanding of the global community. And so that's the other message I like to really push out. One of the lessons learned is how do we actually go beyond the usual suspects and move? So I've already talked about women, but I'm going to have it as my fifth point still, because I don't think you can emphasize women enough. Women are absolutely the essential part of a community. Like I mentioned already, you have the early detection warning signs. Nobody knows community like the women. Time after time, I've seen women alert saying, wait a minute, we're seeing kids coming in and out of our neighborhood we've never seen before. We don't know who they belong to. And again, that's an early detection warning of influences in other areas that are coming in. Women know routes, they know the ability to move in and out, and again, can often provide, if they have a safe space, and that's always a key element, because sometimes with military and police, it's not a safe space for women to communicate, but when they have a safe space, they're often the first to alert security elements in terms of changes and shifts. Along the lines of emphasizing women, one of the first kind of go-to prescriptions that we tend to look at, and this is particularly for countries in transition, is we'll talk about a quota system for women. So is there a quota to actually make sure that there's women representation in a new parliament or in a transitional government? And this is very important. I'm a huge fan of quotas, predominantly because just seeing a woman in a leadership position sends a very important signal to all the young girls that one day they can sit in that position, no matter how bad of a representative the woman is. And that kind of goes into my next point, is women's representation in the quota system does not always equal more women's rights. They're two very different things. In fact, what we've seen over and over is that the women who are elected into parliaments in transition tend to be more conservative and tend to vote with their political party first versus their gender. And I remember this one woman in Kurdistan, or in the Kurdish regional government, saying that to me. She said, I'm a Kurd first, I'm a woman far second. So if you're going to put forward to me a vote as a parliamentarian about Kurdish independence versus personal status law, then I'm happy to negotiate away personal status law. So I think it's important to understand that although a woman may sit in a position, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's a woman's rights defender, which is a very different category, both equally important, but women's rights defenders can be and should be men as well. And it's really important that we find out how to bring in men into the discussion early on. I've been in too many rooms when it talks about gender or women, where it's only women, and too many rooms when it's talking about security sector, where I'm the only woman. And so we need to find a way to balance that out, where more men are looking at women's rights issues and women are part of the security conversation, because I'm very confident it would look differently if we were around the table as well. The sixth point is language matters. Details to language is absolutely essential. Particularly when you're looking at constitutions, you would be surprised, and if there are lawyers in the room, you won't be surprised at all because this is what you do, but the difference between, if you're talking about Islamic law as a source or the source is tremendous. And so really paying attention, and this includes translations, and I've seen countless numbers of negotiations of constitution where people will brush aside the small details of language, and it can have devastating effects in terms of application of the law. So understanding language is absolutely important. It's also understanding what it may mean to people. So for example, Word, when we were looking at the time in Iraq when you had a lot of escalation of violence in local communities. So we did a survey to kind of understand what's causing the incitement, right? And there were obvious things in my mind. You have the sectarian, Sunni Shia, like all kinds of things that could be causing a lot of conflict. One of the top words that was creating incitement after it was being shown on news was the word federalization. So something completely off our radar. And it was partially because it was being used in the wrong way, and it was also being understood as separation. And so people weren't even willing to look at a federal system because they were seeing it as an attempt to divide out the country, which there were definitely conversations around that as well. But the idea that federalization got tied into that conversation was something that a lot of people weren't aware of. And as they were giving presentations and workshops about the different federal systems that exist, there was a reaction of this is another attempt to divide out the region. So understanding language is important. The final example I'll give on language is when I was in Yemen. I was working in some of the remote areas of Hadramaut and was getting a lot of pushback on a campaign that we were doing about early marriage. And we had economists, we had sociologists, everyone signing up on the campaign, but we could not get the religious leaders to sign up with the campaign on early marriage. And so after several conversations with some of the religious leaders, and I was confused because in my mind, this is clearly one of the primary things that's causing harm to young girls, and it's causing harm to the country. So why, as a religious leader, would you not sign on? And it was very interesting to me because they said the word early takes them out of the conversation because it enters into jurisprudence. It starts getting into what's the right age of marriage, what's not the age, and that has a whole legal system attached to it. And so he said, you keep talking about women's safety. He said, why not call the campaign Safe Marriage? Because at that point, you enter into all the laws of causing harm, and that's easy for us to sign up because you can never cause harm. And so just by changing a word in our campaign from early marriage to safe marriage, we were then able to bring the religious leaders on board. And so it was a very powerful alliance that we would have never thought of if, A, we didn't engage in dialogue, but also because we weren't paying attention to what's actually behind the words themselves. So language really matters. The eighth area that I want to talk about is there is something called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that that's particularly difficult when you're looking at foreign agendas, when you're looking at a real fear of globalization, imperialism, colonialization, all these words that in areas of conflict, people are very frightened of because the last thing that they have is to be able to protect their own culture and their own way of life. But I'm also often frightened at some of the rhetoric that will come out that's tied to religious or cultural relativism. And we are willing to stand back, or we go aggressively forward, but nowhere in the middle in terms of really understanding what's the context, what's emerging, what's the socio-political. It goes back to the idea that there's never one driver of conflict. And so really being able to have that conversation, but not hiding behind religion and not hiding behind culture. One of the examples I give is when I was in Khartoum, I was doing a lot of work with Darfurian refugees, and I was stunned. And this was a UN person who was explaining to me that what was happening was part of the Islamic tradition of forced marriage. And, I'm really confused, what do you mean? He said, well, what's going on in Darfur is part of this tradition, and in Islam, you can, through war, and none of it was true. And it was really shocking to me that a UN official would be using an Islamic argument that he's not familiar with at all as a way of justifying one of the worst atrocities which was happening in Darfur. And so I think it's really important that we're able to step forward and name it. That was rape, that was genocide. Forced marriage, whatever fluffy language you want to give into it, using a religious framework is unacceptable. And I think the same thing for a lot of cultural. The key is the approach. So, you know, if you are entering with an approach with prescriptions without understanding the local context, yes, you will always be met with backlash. But oftentimes, and I think particularly in authoritarian regimes, the use of religion and culture is a way to keep the international community out, and finding that balance where we're able to work with local partners, not going in by ourselves, but working with local partners to initiate change is absolutely essential. I already mentioned the power of civil society, but there's also a pitfall within civil society, which is going to be my lesson number 7. And civil society can often, if not working on dialogue and having tools in their own resources, can actually feed into polarization. And particularly when you see a polarization between secular frameworks or religious frameworks, or you see a polarization between, you know, what Samuel Huntington calls the clash of civilizations, but also when you look at the rise in sectarianism and you look at the rise in terms of corruption in government, there tends to be civil society groups that will actually choose sides or who are co-opted by governments. In some parts of the world, we call them royal NGOs because royal families will actually found them and fund them. So, you know, as important as civil society is, and I started off emphasizing civil society, one of the important lessons is also understanding its limitations, as well as the fact that it is a part of society that can be co-opted, particularly by authoritarian regimes, but also sometimes accidentally just by agendas and political agendas. So making sure that that balance within civil society is something that's also very important. So my 9th lesson learned is about the R word, about religion. One of the things that fascinates me is how much we have withdrawn from religion in public life to begin with. And it's not specifically looking at religion within an Islamic framework, but just the role of religion has been pushed into the private, that we've left the field to be defined by the more violent extremist groups. And if you look all around the world, from the Central African Republic, where Christian militias are targeting Muslims, to Burma, where you have Buddhist monks who are targeting Muslims, to the Islamic State using Islam as a form of violent extremism, you're seeing religion being used and played in ways that are very dangerous, particularly if we have a growing religious illiterate community. So, you know, young people and professionals aren't really sure what to do with religion. This started off, I think, for very legitimate purposes. A lot of the not-for-profit and the humanitarian world started off as missionaries, and so there was a pushback to have no religious affiliations, which was a very legitimate concern. But the problem is we may have gone from one side of the pendulum to the other, where we aren't talking about religion at all, and again, that's leaving that space to more extremist groups. So finding a way to talk about religion and to bring it in so that we're not so vulnerable to the violent extremist interpretation, I think is absolutely essential in moving forward. So the 10th and the final, before we get to some questions and answers, is about how much the world has changed. So, you know, we're looking at a new understanding of what is the state. What are borders? What is the role? Who is the duty bearer? In the past, it used to be the government, but now with Assad in Syria, there's a real question of, do we follow these old rules of duty bearers? Do we follow these old rules of sovereignty? And as that shifts, what would it look like and what could it happen? And what you're seeing is an emergence of non-state actors. So, you know, militia groups, community groups, tribal, religious, that are coming in and doing a lot of the activities of the state. The only reason why I talk about that, and I know a lot of the political science majors already know this, is that what hasn't happened is a shift of our institutions. So the way our government is broken down, the way the UN is formed, all of these large institutions that are supposed to be part of the solution haven't been able to change and reform to the changing world. And the example that I often give is the sequencing. You know, when we look at conflict, in the past, we used to talk about, you know, how do we do conflict prevention, and you do kind of, you know, the early detection, and then you have the conflict, and you have escalation, and then you have the transition and post-conflict. And, you know, with my limited experience, which is, you know, only Middle East and Africa, I can say I haven't seen a conflict that follows that sequence. You know, it's kind of 2 steps to the side, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and it's this odd dance that doesn't have any of the sequencing, which all our programming is designed. And so that linear way is something that I think has really left us handicapped to be able to respond to the crises that exist today. Syria is really the straw that broke the camel's back, but if you look, we've had so many crises that have emerged across the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, not all man-made conflicts, even natural disasters, and we're not able to respond in a way that actually follows the code of conduct of do no harm. In fact, in some cases, we've been able to show that we're actually fueling conflict. And so as much as we want to be supportive in helping countries in transition, and particularly countries in conflict, I think it's absolutely essential that we look into our own homes and think differently about how we do approaches and how we do international peace building and conflict resolution. And so with that, I will open up to questions and answers.
Hello. I just want to say thank you for being here. I had one question. What do you think about the conflict in Israel and Palestine?
More specifically, what do you mean by what do I think about the conflict?
Like in the recent events, there's been a lot of, violence between both sides, and I guess the role of UN and what they're doing in regards to the violence, or other community or organizations that are working with this.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, the conflict that the recent escalation, because you've seen a number of escalations over the 60 years, is a great example of how we continue to do the same thing and expect different results. And we all know that's the definition of madness. And it's a real challenge to the peace building community. How do you actually be able to address what we call protracted conflict, especially when you're looking at disproportionate use of force and disproportionate power? That really adds a different level of complications. I think the challenge is you're seeing a lot more progress within the communities themselves than you are internationally, which is one of the biggest challenges when you're looking at a conflict that has lasted as long as the Arab-Israeli conflict. And what I mean by that is you'll actually find very interesting conversations between Israeli and Palestinian civil society, still very small, nowhere near where it needs to be, that you couldn't have internationally. You wouldn't be able to have it in Egypt, you wouldn't be able to have it in New York. It's a very divided diaspora internationally, which has stunted any progress internally. And I think that continues to be one of the biggest challenges. Unfortunately, when you're talking about incitement and things like just the recent news, I mean, if you just watch it, each of the speeches is the case study of incitement and fueling conflict. It is one of those areas where I know for me, I really spend a lot of time trying to think, what is the next step? Like, how do you move past? And I don't know if I have an answer for it yet. I mean, I think that the problem is you've had too many episodes of escalation, which reopens the wound, because you have to have some level of where you're able to then talk about some type of transitional justice or some type of truth and reconciliation or some type of acknowledgement. But the escalation or the events keep being so hot, you're not really able to talk about the peace building side of it. You're really just talking about a ceasefire or trying to end the violence. You're not talking about peace building. And I haven't really been in circles where you've had a strong conversation on the peace building side. It's very much on stopping the violence, which of course is the most important first step.
I think I understand what you mean by the term civil society, but I'm not sure. I was wondering if you could just define what you mean by that.
Thank you. That's a really important question, and I think an assumption that I jumped into. And the reason why I say thank you is because too often people will assume civil society is just NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or not-for-profit organizations. So Save the Children, Mercy Corps are the large international ones, but even on the local ground. But civil society is much broader than that. So civil society includes anyone who isn't officially part of the public sector in terms of government, and then you also have the private sector in terms of for-profit. And that can be, and it doesn't mean that they're not earning income or making money, it just means that's not their primary objective. So university professors are a very important part of civil society. Labor unions, again, with Tunisia and Egypt, this was a huge cornerstone for the Arab Spring, was the labor unions. College campus clubs are part of civil society. So religious, tribal leaders, a lot of civil society, particularly under authoritarian regimes, can actually be in the form of traditional, which is NGOs or media or universities, but will take the shape of religious actors. And so it is a very diverse group. So again, thank you for that question so that I could clarify that it's a very broad-based group of people.
In the United States, we had the civil rights movement, and they used nonviolence. I guess that's a very broad realm, but I was just wondering, in a situation like the Israeli situation, or anything you'd like to comment on, are there opportunities for such a movement to be effective, especially in a violent region like the Middle East?
So are you talking about civil rights movement inside the state of Israel, or?
I meant originally, well, I was thinking of Martin Luther King's nonviolence tactics in Gandhi. I just wondered, being with the Institute of Peace, if you think that those are still valid techniques in volatile regions of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest disservices that was done to the Syrian community was when we started talking about arming the moderates. I mean, because it started off as a very, very powerful nonviolent movement. And if you haven't seen the Trials of Spring, they capture one of the first women's movement in Syria, the Syrian Brides. Really powerful, 5 minutes. It really tells the story of nonviolence. I'm a huge believer that that's the only form of resistance. No matter how powerful the group that you're targeting is, what we know to be true statistically is violent revolutions have an 80% chance of falling back into violence. And so even when you do resort and you feel, it's necessary and, there's no other options, the fact of the matter is just not successful when you pick up arms. Nonviolent resistance has a much more successful rate in terms of post-revolution. And so it's very hard because our first instincts as an international community is also violence. So it's very hard to go on the ground. And one of my favorite programs is a program that I work with on youth. And there are 9 different countries: Nigeria, Uganda, Somalia, Kenya, and then Jordan, Morocco, and Yemen, and Sudan. And whenever I talk about nonviolence, the youth get really frustrated with me. Well, what are we going to do? We're watching this happening in Syria. We're watching this corruption that's eating up our countries. A lot of the Nigerians are so infuriated by the corruption. What do we do? What actions can we take? And I think that's the trick, is if you're going to say don't resort to violence, which is the big message of USIP, how do you resolve conflict without resorting to violence? Then you have to provide with tools and resources for them to be able to do something different. And the reality is, it's similar to our own policymakers. That's a long-term change. It is a long game, and most people want quick turnaround. But in terms of how I feel, I think it's very important, even in a context like Israel and Palestine, where you have where you have a protracted conflict that seems endless. I truly believe that nonviolence is the only way that you'll have traction. And you're seeing, we don't hear the news. Again, it's still a small group, but we don't hear the news that comes out of Ramallah, out of Nablus, out of Jerusalem, out of Gaza, and out of Tel Aviv, where you're having a lot more work between the communities on nonviolence than unfortunately we hear about. And it's still very small. It's not strong enough to change the political scene, but it's there, and it's been growing, and it's, I think, very powerful on a small community conflict level. We're still not seeing it impact the national, but I think it eventually will. I truly believe, and just going back to that other question, that it will happen from within Israeli and Palestinian society change. I don't think the international community has any influence on this conflict, but I do think that the people who are living in it have had enough and will initiate change. I'm also accused of being a Pollyanna, but, I always say at USIP, part of our job is creating hope, so I hope that's true.
So on the pamphlet we were given, or at least I was given when we walked in, it says you present the idea of not imposing Western values in Middle Eastern problems. So I know you've spoken about nonviolence, but are there any other specific Western values that you mean by that?
So I wouldn't say just Western. I think in general, my belief is very much that every conflict, the local actors, the local people know the solution. And so our job is to really find them and to listen to them and then provide resources and sometimes technical assistance, particularly when you're looking at constitutions and transitional justice, sometimes you need the comparative, but it's not to provide prescription. So it's not specifically Western, it's just against the idea of going into a country with prescriptions. We need to be really ready to listen and to absorb. Oftentimes in countries, so for example, when I was in Yemen, I had a lot of women who would say things to me like, oh, you're Muslim, you're Arab, take your American Western thoughts back to South Carolina, like it doesn't belong here. And my response was, I'm on the land of the Queen of Sheba. This is historically one of the greatest lands when you're talking about women's rights. In The Quran, it praises the Queen of Sheba for her leadership. So this isn't Western, this is yours. And similarly, when I'm in Iraq and they say rule of law, this is such a European Western idea, Hammurabi came from your land. So the idea that all these values are Western is false. I mean, these are ancient civilizations with great glorified history, and sometimes we have to remember and bring that in as part of the story, so it's not just coming in as imposed and, only one person has, the right of women's rights or rule of law and all these concepts. When in fact, it really, again, it goes back to the idea of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is something for us as humanity that is truly universal that we can tap into.
Thank you. And continuing on with that, so I guess also another question that I have is, do you think that traditionally Western countries, as in Germany or England or the United States, should present or be a presence of support in the Middle East and the problems that are occurring? Because obviously, you don't think that they should go in with a plan to fix it. As you were just explaining, the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to be something that's solved from within. So do you believe that they should be there as a support, or just not include themselves in the conflict?
It's a tricky one. I don't think not being involved in goes back to the idea of just as humanity. I think everyone needs to be aware of what's happening across the world and finding ways to be part of the solution. And whether that's strictly bilateral in terms of foreign government, that's where I get a little bit more hesitant, particularly because we don't have a good track record in terms of Western countries. I can't think of where we've done it well. Again, most of the studies have actually shown we fuel conflict and we tend to add more of the divides. So we just don't have that track record. But I also don't think abandoning and leaving things alone is a solution either. And particularly, I just think about when I first entered Iraq and when I first entered Libya, seeing what Saddam Hussein had done to the country and seeing what Gaddafi had done to the country, it just flabbergasted me that they had gotten away with so much for decades and nobody cared. If anything, we might have been complacent and supportive. And so that has to stop as well. Now, what does that look like? Light footprint, big footprint, diplomatic solutions with military supporting, or military with diplomatic on the thing. I think that's a big debate that's happening. What I know is what we've done hasn't worked, and goes back to the point that I ended with, is we need to rethink how the international community works, and we need to start by rethinking our large institutions, which is the hardest place to start. So again, understanding that challenge.
Assalamu alaikum, may peace be with you. Seeing that the whole media is universal all over the world, and it seems that the Muslims are the scapegoats all around, and that seems to be filtering into the American society, in which we have groups which are Islamophobes, and the questions that are being raised is that between Sharia, Islamic Sharia, and the Constitution opposed to each other, and similar questions even being raised by the presidential candidates. So what kind of a message can the majority of us, whether we are Muslims or Christians or Jews, convey, not only here in the States, but maybe carried abroad too?
So I mentioned the program Generation Change, which is predominantly working with youth activists globally. And one of my favorite things is when I first went into the countries, first we did specific country-by-country training, and then we brought them all together. But each of the countries, Yemen, Nigeria, when I was in Uganda, were worried about me. And it really blew me away. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, is it safe? Do you travel on public transportation? Do you wear the headscarf in America? Is it safe for you? And I was like, you guys are the ones in war-torn or in transitional countries. Like, why are you asking about me? And the perception is very much Muslims in America are under attack. In some of the borders where I've spent time, in the Zaatari camp, in the border between Jordan and Syria, and in Hatay between Jordan and Syria, the killings of the Chapel Hill girls was actually distributed, and it's being used as a recruitment strategy. So there is this story. It's not just Western media. There's an international narrative about a war on Islam, and unfortunately, both sides are feeding that narrative, and they're manifesting the clash of civilizations. I don't actually think it exists, but I think with enough of that rhetoric, it can actually be manifested. And I think it's this point where it's really important for individual citizens to step back and to say, we don't accept this rhetoric. There's always multiple drivers of conflict. It's very rarely strictly an ideology or strictly economic. Like I've never been in a conflict analysis where we have, here it is. It's very complicated, it's very nuanced, but the use of propaganda isn't new, and it's much easier to mobilize people one way or the other. For God, against God, for my God, against your, it's an easier way to mobilize, and you're seeing, and again, on both sides, you're seeing a lot of that take place. I have to say that the presidential debates have been very worrisome. It's the first time since 9/11 that I am scared. And I recently wrote an article about that on the Chapel Hill killings, where I'm actually afraid leaving. And again, I'm in Baghdad, I'm in Benghazi, and I'm afraid in my own home. And that's a problem. And I think it really is time for the solidarity. I mean, the most important thing is for Muslims not to feel that they are the ones who have to own the issue or to apologize. I think that is the critical mistake that's happening. I think it really is owned by everyone. We're seeing a rise of extremism from non-state actors that is frightening and is truly a global threat. And any divides will only feed into the threat versus uniting and showing a different way of combating it. And that's what I hope to be a part of, is the united front where we can actually say, we reject all of these different narratives.
Thank you. It was a wonderful lecture. I really appreciated it. My question is something you mentioned earlier in your lecture about sanctions, and that seems to be a popular tool in the international community, as opposed to choosing military intervention in a location. But what effect, though, do sanctions have on the populations, those within the country, as opposed to the government of that country?
Yeah. So, I mean, sanctions is absolutely a horrendous way to cripple a society, and very rarely targets the government, or affects the government it's targeting. And I think that at least now you're seeing a little bit more of conversations around smart sanctions. So they'll talk about military or arms. So the conversation has definitely matured over the past decade or so. But economic sanctions it actually has the opposite of effect. It can, in most cases, it'll demolish the opposition before it'll demolish the regime that you're targeting. And you want the opposition to thrive and to survive. I was in Iraq in 97 and 98, which was kind of the height of the sanctions. And I remember almost every area, every city that I was going to, Saddam Hussein was building a palace. And so it was very much in your face. 5,000 children dying from malnutrition, not affecting me. But it was what sanctions was doing. And it's a challenge because, obviously you don't want military intervention either. But the reality is sanctions is a slow, torturous death, and you watch communities fall apart under it. And so in no circumstances can I ever, particularly blind economic sanctions the way we had in the Oil for Food program, in no way could I ever support that as an instrument of change. It really devastates. And what it does is devastate the most vulnerable, which tend to be women, elderly, and the disabled. And so not only are you devastating communities, you're specifically targeting the most vulnerable.
Hi, I'd like to begin by thanking you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
My question is, based on events that have happened in the past in the United States, there's been a conversation about a need for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the United States. I'd like to hear your opinion on the need for this goal and the steps we need to take as citizens to help pursue this.
Can you tell me more? Because I'm not familiar with the conversation that's happening domestically. Can you tell me more?
Like stuff that, events that happened in Ferguson and New York, the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
The conversation has just come up for this to happen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I'm a strong believer when you skip Truth and Reconciliation, no matter how much history is passed, you will automatically find yourself pushing a reset button and having to face it at one point or another. So I do think that there's a lot of conversations that we need to have domestically, and until you're able to have them in a way that addresses institutions in structural. So what we call structural violence. It's built into the systems, and what's happening is that you're pitting individuals to really bear the brunt of what's happening structurally. And in Black Lives Matter, the individuals are community and police, which ironically is a big part of what work we do internationally. We call it justice and security dialogues, where we talk to police and we talk to communities and we try to figure out best ways to work. And ironically, when Ferguson was happening, I was in Libya at the time, and the police were coming and saying, "Can we come to America and talk about the lessons you're teaching us to there?" So they were making the connection very clearly. There's a great article in the Washington Post that talks about Black Lives Matters and Palestinian Lives Matters and the similarities between living under occupation and that. And if you, I can give you my card and I can send you the link for it, and it just goes over the similarities in ways. And you see that kind, again, the universality in terms of people really connecting over the issues. I'm a huge believer in some type of truth and reconciliation. Like I said, if you skip it, you always find yourself having to have it at one point or another. So no matter how much time has passed, it's not a system you can just bypass and hope it'll go away. And when you don't have it, then all the problems then get built into the institutions you build, and it's very difficult to solve. But that's why you start looking at major institutional reform. And I think for a lot of what we're seeing in different, from Ferguson to Baltimore, it's actual structural violence. I don't think it's just individual.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry, there's a great book called The New Jim Crow's Laws. It's not a new book, but that's the title of the book, and it's phenomenal. I mean, it was my kind of 101 in understanding what's happening domestically.
So the question I have is related to like relationships between cultural groups, whether it's in like London or in Western countries or here in the United States. I don't know if everybody has kept up with it, but I know like recently this year, I've seen either on the news or read articles of individuals in Western countries, for example, in England or in the United States, are going to the Middle East to then join these terrorist groups. They're recruiting them online, using different methods to get to them. And I remember reading an article about a secondary schools in Birmingham that have a preventive measure put in place, and they're talking to the kids about these individuals that are trying to reach out to them before they actually get them to join them. And I know there are obviously people here in the United States that are Islamophobes, and there are always going to be people that are ignorant to, or that are just ignorant and not open to other ideas. So how do you, like, what would you say is the best thing for people in Western countries so that there is the unity that you spoke of before?
Mm-hmm. So the Western population of foreign fighters is like 0.00001%. It's a very small percentage. I know that there's a lot of media and I'm often joking when I probably shouldn't be joking, but like, what's going to happen in an airport if someone like comes and like throws a can at me and thinks I'm an ISIS bride because of all the places I travel? Like, there's just such a hype about this, and it's still a very small percentage. The largest supplier of foreign fighters is actually Tunisia. So it's interesting because it's the most stable and successful country, and yet it's sending a lot of, or people are going a lot to Syria. The recruitment strategies they're definitely using social media. I mean, when you look at some of the statistics that are coming out, it's frightening. Again, keeping in mind actual penetration in countries is small, so most likely the social media campaign is targeting the West, and so that is definitely a big push. I worry, the Birmingham, what they're doing in the UK and in some other areas could actually create new extremists. Because you're isolating and you're marginalizing and you're doing these, say something, see something, and then you're having all these Islamophobia messaging. And so, like for example, the clock with the young kid with Ahmed when the teacher called in, I felt a lot of sympathy for the teacher because you're giving them all these messages of Islam as terrorist, and you may not be saying that, but the images that you're presenting is delivering that message, and then you're instructing them to report. And then there's this huge, blowback when there is a report, versus really saying, how do we de-link this messaging? If we're going to be talking about profiling, how do we actually get accurate profiles in place where it's not just brown people or Muslim people, and we're actually looking at it more holistically if we're going to be using that strategy. I personally would like to see an end to profiling, but if we're going to use that strategy, it can be done in a much better way. The solution is conversations and dialogue. I mean, you know, I really worry when people are saying, if you see this extremist group coming after you, I mean, you know, again, it's 0.001%. So 95% of these students are introduced through the training program. And, you know, it goes into marginalized, I mean, you have a whole gang mentality, like a lot of what's being done to try and figure out the countering violent extremism is actually studying gangs and why people join gangs, because it's much more similar to that phenomenon than it is to guerrilla warfare phenomenon, for example, or any type of liberation movement. It's a very different form. So I think that that's a little bit more of what we have to ask is why are our youth, and I think globally, you know, I feel safe saying globally we continue to fail our youth, where we target them, where we are consistently afraid of them. You know, we talk about the youth bulge or the youth problem rather than seeing it as a youth surge and a new, you know, capital assets that it's growing. Like the way we phrase it is always negative. And so I think that that's the larger conversation that we have to have is what is actually sending them towards a more extreme group and what are we failing to provide? I think there was a question up here. Oh.
So thank you very much. It's a really, really delightful conversation, and I learned so much from it. I wanted to just ask you a couple of things. First, looking at Syria, and you talked about obviously nonviolent movements and Western values, and often Western values come with Western interests as well. So if you look at current situation in Syria, you have a Russian interest, now you know the Western interest, and pretty much zones where you can fly your planes and things like that. Do you see a solution? And I feel bad for people who are caught in that situation. Mm-hmm. What is the way forward? Is there any hope? That's the first thing. The second question is that we live in a globalized and a smaller world now. Mm-hmm. And what happens in one place certainly impacts in other areas. There was a recent election in Canada, mm-hmm. and you know the topic of conversation that was there. We saw some debates here, and we saw a topic of conversation there. We have a hearing on Tuesday at the Hill, and mm-hmm. that may impact elections here too. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about what it means in today's world about conflict and situations in one part of the world impacting things on the other part. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before you answer that question, I just want to say that the Athenaeum Symposia would not exist without Dr. Rai. He told me to start it 4 years ago.
Thank you for that. In terms of Syria, you know, it's difficult. I mean, so many of the decisions we've made has put us in a very difficult situation where we're you know, looking at protracted conflict, and we're talking decades versus years, and it's very unfortunate because it didn't have to be that way. But you know, best case scenario, in my opinion, Assad leaves today, you're still looking at a decade to really help rebuild, and it's fragmented. You have a third of the population on the move. Again, we're not equipped for the humanitarian crisis that's emerged. You know, you hear a lot about the migration to Europe, but the neighboring countries are fully saturated. They've taken the Palestinians, they've taken, at one point, Syrians had left, and you know, before the major crisis, Lebanese, Iraqis, I mean, like, they're fully saturated, and they're now very fragile. You know, as bad as Syria is, it hasn't hit rock bottom. The majority of camps still haven't been involved in the conflict. And so there's still a lot of preventative work that can be done. A lot of my work is in camps because I think that there's a lot more prevention that can be done. And I really worry about the day that the camps, which are predominantly youth, become engaged in the conflict. Over and over, people are choosing not to be engaged, but that will have an expiration date when they see the international community do nothing and they have nowhere to go and they can't stay. Winter is coming, and I don't mean that of Game of Thrones, I mean like in terms of the refugees, like it's, what are they gonna do? And so it's a real challenge. You know, I really believe in dialogue and peace talks. I really think that we need to, you know, if it's Geneva or something, to reestablish, but it has to have some muscle. We can't just bring them, let's all hold hands so no one can hold a gun. It has to be, the U.S. has to use a lot of its influence, which at this point, we haven't seen a policy that's willing to do that. And again, for very legitimate reasons. The public itself, there's such a fatigue from the wars in the Middle East. The public itself doesn't want to get engaged. But the reality is it will continue to get worse, and we can't escape how it'll affect us. And just the fact of Russia's involvement, that tells you directly how it's now affecting the U.S. And a lot of people will even go as far back and say, if we had paid attention to Ukraine, and there's just a lot that has happened. And if you look at the initial onset of the war on terror, Russia and China were virtually, we couldn't even hear their whispers. And because of our investment on the other side, which is predominantly the Middle East, they're now the fastest growing economies. And so we almost contributed to a lot of what we're seeing today. And how do you begin to retract? It's very difficult to say. But I would say a push on dialogue is one of the most important things. I do think Putin has very cleverly use the Islamic State to advance his own purposes, and it's important that the international community doesn't fall into that trap. Oh, and then on the smaller world, I think it's what actually gives me hope is the small interactions that you're seeing, the success stories. Just looking at the networks that I work with across the world and how they support one another. People in Uganda are tied now to people in Palestine, or tied now to people in Kenya. And you're just really seeing a resilience growing out from the communities themselves. And in a lot of ways, I think that's what we're witnessing, whether it's Ferguson or Baltimore or the Arab Spring or whatever you want to call it. You're seeing a reclaiming of people power, of people actually saying, all right, we know status quo isn't enough. We're just not sure what to do. And so you're seeing the accountability in the streets, and you're seeing a lot of this take place. The danger is, and what we always talk about nonviolent protests, is you should never go unless you're ready to take your 6-year-old or your grandmother. You should be at a point where you know it's safe, and that's not happening. A lot of people are going prematurely. They're not doing the prep work. Someone mentioned Martin Luther King. The training that went behind before every protest. This wasn't accidental. There was a lot of training that was involved, and a lot of that's not being offered, and so people are taking to the streets without understanding all of the work that comes beforehand. And it's one of the things that I'm now working with the Quaker Society to talk about how we can actually go and train some of the youth who are really eager to take to the street, but make sure that they actually have the right tools before they go out.